All right, and welcome back to WBCR 88.3 The Saints. I'm Justin Kenny as always, and with me tonight we have Tom Turcich. So, Tom, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
So I am the 10th person to walk around the world over 7 years. I walked roughly 28,000 miles across 38 countries, and I did so with a dog, my dog Savannah, who I adopted in Austin, Texas, after a few months of walking on my own. And Savannah is the first dog to walk around the world. And now I am writing a memoir based on my travels. It'll come out with Skyhorse Publishing this October. Just set in pretty much the final manuscript, just the last couple edits. So that's where the bulk of my energies have gone lately. But today, went for a bike ride and played some pickleball and just kind of enjoying a easier Sunday.
Yeah, because that was going to be one of the things I was wondering is that, like, because like I know you did a podcast on Audible, like yeah, it was on Audible that I saw it, and
Mhm.
I was wondering like, how have you not written a book yet about all these experiences you did?
Yeah, the book is coming out. It'll be out in October. I'm really happy with it. I know the publisher is excited about it. And you're writing is something I didn't really discover until after college. I
Yeah.
had read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I was laying in bed at like 1 in the morning and throwing around ideas in my head about what I would write. And then kind of fully formed this idea came to me, and I was up until all hours of the morning writing it down. And then for whatever reason, I found I really enjoyed writing, and so I kind of stuck with it. And then
Yeah.
as I was traveling, and I was writing blog posts. And then afterwards, yeah, I was lucky enough to get a publishing deal. And so it's been really fun to work with Skyhorse and my editor, Jesse. It's the first time I've had an editor, and it's been really useful for me just to improve as a writer, to have someone to bounce things off of or tell me when something doesn't come across the way it does. But really excited for this book. It's such a big adventure, and there's so much growth that happened over those 7 years that it
Yeah.
was difficult to distill into just a book, but I think it does a fairly good job.
Yeah, and I know that like there's another guy who's a friend of the show who's a local historian. Well, he's a historian who lives locally. His name's David Petrugia. He's been on the show
Mhm.
like 4 or 5 times now. He's written numerous books, and although one of his books was supposed to be turned into a TV show about the 1920 election, 2020 didn't really happen. But he always told me the biggest pain in the you know what with writing a book with like a memoir or something like that is just the editing part. It's the hardest thing to do in that kind of that type of writing.
Yeah,
But
it's definitely different. I enjoyed a lot though. I like the editing because it's kind of like it's like this big puzzle that you're tinkering with
yeah,
then, and kind of the pulling the teeth is when you're actually getting everything down. That can be especially for me, when I'm going back through journals and I'm Google earthing places to get the details back in my head, and looking through past videos, all that. Like the writing things accurately was sometimes just really tedious, and so the editing was a bit of a relief from for me.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because like I also know when writing a memoir too. I mean, I haven't written mine, but I was trying to get another person within the radio station to do it. Joe Riley, who's the former president of the New York State Broadcasters Association. He has like all these stories like negotiating with Mario Cuomo, Watts Beach. There's a ton of like Larry King stories. And one of the things they were trying to tell him when writing it was you want to create somewhat of a thread when you're writing it. So you want to kind of create a way that's easy for people to follow. So you're not kind of like zigzagging the entire way. People do it in different ways. Like Bob Iger and George W. Bush in their memoirs did it based off certain deals or bills that they had. Like Phil Jackson did his on 11 Rings with going over 11 principles that he used for coaching people like Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant. And there's other ones that people do different ways, but kind of just want to keep that thread, which is, I guess, the main idea of it in some ways.
Yeah, you got to have some sort of narrative. It just can't be disparate short stories. Yeah, it's not. there's got to be some narrative to it, and however you do it, that's hopefully effective.
Yeah. And so I want to ask you too a question about a very important person or dog that went around the world with you. And she seems to be one of the big things that people seem to get their attention grabbed by. Because I told a bunch of people I was having you on, and I was going to have you on. I sent the video you did, one of the videos you did, I think was Great Big Story. And
Mm.
the number one thing everybody always was intrigued by was Savannah. So can you tell us a little bit about Savannah?
Yeah, she's the attraction for sure. Um, yeah, so I had walked like 4 months on my own from New Jersey down to Texas, and I had done a little bit of camping before then, but going on my own and sleeping in all these different places, I just kept having that recurring thought when I would wake up in the middle of the night of, man, it'd be really nice to have a dog that could listen while I slept so I could kind of relax a little bit at night.
Yeah,
There's that part of your brain that is just always going. It's difficult to turn off, even when you're in a very good campsite. If it's not yours, you're just slightly on edge, and you're kind of guaranteed to wake up like 4 times a night. So I kept having this thought as I was walking down the US. And then I'm also thinking, I've never walked abroad before, and soon I'm going to be walking Central America, which at the time, maybe still today, it was the most dangerous region in the world. And, and it was intimidating going into that, not having walked abroad before. So then that on top was thinking, man, it'd be nice to have a dog to, at least provide some deterrence to maybe some would-be bad actors. And so
yeah,
I got into Austin, and my cousin and her husband were living there. So I was going to stay there for maybe a week or two. I wasn't sure. But that first day, I went over to an adoption center, Austin Pets Live. And I spent about 2, 3 hours there and greeting all these different dogs, and none of them really fit. Some were a little older. And then right as I was about to leave, they brought out Savannah and her sister. Her name was Lulu at the time, Savannah. And I kind of knew right away. I was like, oh, this is perfect because I'll adopt this dog, and she'll know no other life but the life on the road. And I knew there'd be, a little bit of an upstart cost, which was, training her and getting her strong enough to walk 20 plus miles a day. But then after that, it would be well worth it because, she would just know only me. And so, yeah, I adopted her right there. And then it was a couple weeks getting her vaccines. And for the first month or so, walking from Houston down to Mexico, there it was a lot of headbutting between me and Savannah because she was a puppy and she didn't know what I wanted of her. She was terrified of cars. She wasn't really food motivated, so it was difficult to get her trained on the leash. And so I was really frustrated initially. I'm
yeah.
thinking, man, what am I doing? Like, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I'm gonna have to return her by the time I get to Mexico or, to the border. And then something switched. I had this conversation with my mom after a few days, and she just helped reorient my focus. And she was like, yeah, it's only right now the miles aren't what matter. What matters is getting Savannah trained. And so I was trying to do it both ways. I was trying to walk 20 miles a day and train Savannah. And so what I started to do was just, all right, the first hour of every day, I'm just training Savannah. And then I was going to take her out midday, and then towards the evening, and just a dedicated hour of training. And pretty quickly, she kind of got over her fear of cars, and she was walking on a leash. And then next thing you know, we're in Mexico, and she's walking the full 24 miles a day with me and loving it. And yeah, and then, ultimately, she was such a beast. I mean, like very quickly she got up to speed and strong enough. And then by the time we were in Central America, or by the time we were in South America on our second year, she was in far better shape than I could ever be. And we were pushing up these mountains every day, and she'd have energy at the end of the day. We'd walk these 30-mile days through the desert, and she'd be running circles at the end of the day, still wanting to play. So she has lived a very good and full life, and she's an absolute beast.
Yeah. And so you brought up how at the beginning how Central America at the time when we started was the most dangerous region in the world. And I remember when I looked into some of your videos and stuff, you had a couple stories from not only Central America, but even other regions of the world where you were kind of in danger a little bit. Like remember seeing a video and also hearing about your experience with the Turkish military at the Turkish border, I believe, and like other incidents of like walking past some dead bodies in El Salvador.
Mm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and how did you kind of keep yourself safe during all those moments on this wild journey you went on?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is, I mean, the world is actually very safe.
Yeah,
I would say there are incidences where, and there's moments, and there's the occasional bad actor, but I say overall, I don't want to overrepresent like the danger that I was in. I think that's one of the most remarkable things about traveling on foot and the way I did is you just kind of see over and over and over again. So everyone's just living their life. And it's you don't write news stories and there's not articles written about another, 3 million people live their lives peacefully today because
yeah,
it's not that interesting. But that being said, you have to be smart as well when you're a foreigner abroad in a place that you don't know. And especially when you're, a tall, gangly white guy pushing a baby carriage with a dog. You stand out like a sore thumb in most of the places. And so a lot of it is just not being an idiot, and that takes a few different forms. I think I think we have a very good sense of who to trust and who not to trust. And for me, it took a little while to develop that. I didn't have that developed growing up. I grew up in a very peaceful town in New Jersey. And it wasn't until I started walking and I met some people that, maybe I thought I should trust that I probably shouldn't. And it just kind of got into uncomfortable situations where I realized, oh, like that feeling in my gut is something that you need to listen to. And probably like women definitely have it more developed than most men do because they're in more stressful, maybe threatened situations on
yeah,
throughout their lives. And so they have that more developed, but it took me a while to develop. So I think part of it is listening to that. And another way to feed that, or another way to like use that is just knowing that I was always passing through places. And so there was going to be people that I would meet right away and I would trust immediately. And so knowing that if I just got any bad feeling from someone, I would just walk away or, say, oh, no, thanks, whatever it was in the situation, knowing that, look, up ahead, I'd meet someone and I would have no doubts about their intentions. And so knowing that that helped me kind of navigate maybe situations when I was in my earlier days of traveling would have been more liable to just be polite and kind of leak into when I didn't want to be in that situation. So that's part of it. And then also you just try avoiding to walk at night. And probably the most dangerous thing about that is just the cars, honestly. But also it's, maybe there's some people out drinking or whatever, and that's probably more likely to get you into trouble. Uh, and then otherwise, it's sometimes you just got to wear a scowl when you're going through these new places, and just look a little tougher than you are. And maybe that helps. But yeah, for the most part, it was only really very few malicious encounters. I would say really actually probably only like one malicious encounter.
yeah. Yeah, because like I know that like there's a whole entire theory that Jonathan Haidt came out with in his book, The Coddling of America, whereas although the crime rate in recent years has gone down, people are now sheltering their kids more and more. And he hypothesizes partially that it's due to like the 24-hour news cycle that developed in the 80s and 90s, just repeatedly showing crime, 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 but they're not going to show people just living quiet lives, like you point out. But with that kind of thought process and the whole entire of all that, one thing I was kind of curious on was how did you kind of plot your route? Did you just have a predetermined route? Did you kind of just go as you went? Did you use like any news sources or anything to help you say like, oh, maybe I should stay away from this region or anything of that nature? How did you kind of do your route or pick your route?
So on a larger scale, it was informed by two primary things. The first was I wanted to hit every country in the world, so or not every country, every continent in the world. So that ended up not being possible because I wasn't able to get into Australia due to COVID. So I hit six of the continents, but so that was the original. That was the first factor. I wanted to hit every continent, and then the other thing was just how do I do that with as little visa trouble as possible. And so that really informed kind of two, I guess, three major sections of the walk. It didn't affect North America, but in South America, it made my decision to go west, so through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, versus going on the east along Brazil because you need a visa for that. And then it's partially informed the way I walked Africa. I only walked Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. I needed a visa for Algeria, but for a lot of the countries in Africa, you need visas, and also Africa is just massive. And I was like, this would take me 3 years to walk, so I'm not going to do that. And then in Asia, it pushed me north, where the initial plan was to walk up to Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, with Kazakhstan beforehand, and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, and I would need a visa for Uzbekistan, but and a visa extension for Kazakhstan, but none of the other countries. Versus if I had went south, I would need visas for a bunch of the countries towards the Southeast Asia, and so that kind of informed the route. So that was the major construction of the path, and then on a smaller scale, it was really country by country basis. For
Yeah.
the Americas, a lot of it I ended up following the Pan American, primarily because in South America, it's like the major road, the only major road, say in southern Peru or in northern Chile. And so that's just what you're going to be on, unless you're up in the Andes. And then, in Europe, a lot of Western Europe, you can just follow a lot of bike paths. And then it's just kind of this balance that you have to figure out in each country. What is the density of the country? How many roads do they have? How many people are driving? What are the roads like? What's the topography? And so I got very good by the end of being in a country maybe a day or two, or maybe not even, maybe even before, and picking out a route that was fairly direct and also fairly peaceful. Whereas in the beginning, especially in the US, I was just walking these roads that were just loud and dangerous and maybe even out of the way until kind of finding better, more peaceful routes to walk. And it really is just a country by country thing you have to feel out.
Hmm. Do you think you'll go back and do Australia now at this point, or it's kind of that time's got to pass by now?
I mean, I might, I definitely open to the possibility, but even when I finished the walk, I was thinking, man, I would love to go back there and do that. And Mongolia as well, which I wasn't able to walk, also closed due to COVID. I would love to do both of those, but there's no way I'll bring Savannah. She has no interest in flying. She doesn't care about, getting to that continent and walking it. So I might, but there's no way I'd bring Savannah for that long flight for something she doesn't care about.
Yeah, I hear Mongolia is great though. I have a friend who studied abroad there, and it's kind of funny because he's kind of the type who travels to one country and makes it his entire personality. But he has great stories about Mongolia though, so I will say that.
Oh,
Um,
I've heard amazing things, and that was like I was looking forward to that my entire walk. This very idyllic, massive. You'd have to have a guide through it. You have to put stuff
yeah,
ahead. But yeah, it just wasn't able to work out. So one day I'll get there.
yeah, yeah. So another thing, I should probably ask you these two questions because I know a lot of people are probably screaming at me at their whether they're listening to us on the radio or their headphones or whatever. Some people are probably asking me or yelling at me to ask you these two questions that I probably should have asked you at the beginning. Being first off, what made you decide to do this whole entire walk? And number two, how did you kind of like fund yourself through this walk?
Yeah, so first one, the reason I walked around in the world was initially I was born from the death of a close friend, my friend Anne Marie, who passed away when she was 16. I
Yeah,
was 17. It's very formative for me. I had thought about death before, but it wasn't until Anne Marie died that I really kind of understood how close it was and how close it could be.
yeah,
And so I reflected on what I valued in life, what I wanted out of life, and I knew I wanted to travel. I wanted to be forced into adventure because I was timid and introverted and I wanted to grow out of that and I wanted to understand the world. And then so I started looking for ways to fulfill all those things, also with the idea in mind that I was broke. I was in high school, I had $1,000 in my bank account. And so when I discovered this guy, Carl Bushby, an ex-British paratrooper, it really just clicked immediately. I was like, this fits everything I want out of life. And so I set that as sort of the vision of what I was aiming for. And then it was 8 years of going to school, paying off loans, living at home, working, saving until I had enough money that I thought I could begin and bleed it out for 2 years, maybe walk down to Uruguay, Patagonia, something like that, and gain a sponsor. And luckily, I was able to get a sponsor before I left. I had some articles written in Philadelphia Inquirer and NJ.com and these local newspapers. And this company, Philadelphia Sign, saw the article and they knew Anne Marie, the owner knew Anne Marie, and they just opened this international branch. So it was kind of really fortunate that basically they reached out and said, "Hey, we want to sponsor your trip and we want to donate $1 a mile into Anne Marie and her friend, my friend also, Shannon, also passed her scholarship fund."
yeah.
And so that was it. I mean, they paid me less than minimum wage, which was more than enough. And
Mhm.
then I lived on that for 2 years. I basically put all my savings, paid off the rest of my student loans, lived on the sponsorship for the first 2 years. And then when I got to Europe, it was more expensive. I started a Patreon, and the Patreon supplemented that enough that I was able to live very comfortably when I was out on the road. And also, you don't need much, um, especially when you're, just young and on fire with this idea that you've had in your head for 8 years. But also, Central South America, it's very affordable. And then once you're out of Western Europe, it's also very affordable. And I'm not paying for hotels very often. I'm not paying rent. And yeah, it wasn't, I'd say it's a very attainable, cheap lifestyle if you are willing to walk, all the time and find places to camp each night.
Yeah, I'm. That was a lot of facts you point out that you paid off your student loans. I know a lot of people are probably wondering about that since you also said earlier in your interview you went to college. So
Yeah, oh man, yeah, that was a bear.
yeah, that's the one thing to make sure you point out that you paid off. Because I know a lot of people are probably wondering how you did it with student loans, but good thing you didn't have student loans. So
Yeah, no, man, yeah, it took a couple years, yeah, but that was the main focus, just put everything towards them.
so another thing is I know that you're not the first person to do this. Although there is a recent trend in the last, I think since like the 60s or 70s of doing this within modern times.
Hmm.
Um, although still it's not many people who have done it. Have you been able to communicate or talk with anybody else or meet anybody else who has done the same thing you have?
Yeah, I have. I've spoken with Carl Bushby, who was my idol back then, a few times, and he gave me advice right before I started, actually. He was generous enough to talk on the phone for a little bit and give me some advice before I was proven at all. And then at the end of the walk, on the day I finished, there was some filmmakers that were with me, and they had just filmed Steve Newman, who was basically the other inspiration. It was Steve Newman and Carl Bushby. Steve Newman's an Ohioan who walked around the world over 3 years in the late 60s, just with a backpack. And they had him on the phone at my homecoming, and so I spoke with him. So basically, my journey was bookended by speaking with these two people who inspired the walk. So it was really, really incredible.
Hmm. Yeah, because I know a lot of people would be kind of wondering, like right now they're kind of probably thinking that you're probably like the first person to do this, but they probably wouldn't know that you're the most. I believe there's one other person who did it recently, if I'm not mistaken, from my research. But there's a long line of others that come before you. This whole entire not
Yeah, I
really
think.
adventure seeking is well, adventure seeking. But I was trying to think of the right word to use.
Yeah, I think it's the 10th. I before I thought it was I don't know what number I thought it was. I wasn't sure, but then Afar did this really deep dive on me and walking around the world, and they came up with 10. And I think if you look on Wikipedia, I think I'm the 10th. So I think that's what it is. And then yeah, Savannah's the first. And what's funny about Savannah is that like towards the end of the walk, I applied to Guinness World Records for her.
Yeah,
And they said there's no competition in this field, so we can't give it to you. And I was like, well, isn't that the point of being the first to do something? So I don't know. It's this very weird, like catch 22 that she wasn't able to get it in the Guinness, but there's definitely no other dog who's done it. So yeah,
yeah. Guinness is a weird corporation from
it
everything.
is. Yeah, yeah.
There are people who are just professional record breakers where they just spend all their time trying to come up with ways to break world records, and you'll find some people have like 26 of them or whatever, but then you'll find that there's like world dictators that love it and stuff like that. I think
Yeah.
John Oliver did a piece on it, but it's just like nowadays it's mostly, for lack of a better way of looking at it, it's mostly pretty much a marketing thing.
Yeah,
So
it is. Yeah. And it costs a lot of money too. They have them like you can fly them out or whatever, have yeah, to do the marketing for some event or something. So kind of lost its purity, it seems.
yeah, it's just the like you don't see it all the time. So if everybody goes like, "Oh, this is a Guinness World event," it just adds that extra attraction to it. Just
Yeah.
adds the extra sizzle, as my boss Darren likes to say at the station. Um, well, I mean, he was head of promotions at another station, so
Yeah.
he calls it sizzle. He knows what he's talking about, I guess. But another thing that I wanted to ask you was about your time, because you did point out that your whole entire trip went along with COVID for part of it. Can you tell us about your experience with the world shutting down and not being home? What was that like, and how did you get through it?
Yeah. So I was in Azerbaijan when kind of the first word of COVID broke out. So where I was in my walk was that I had stopped in Georgia, which is to the west of Azerbaijan in the Caucasus and I guess Central Asia. And I had stopped there in winter in December. And then I flew home to get an Uzbek visa and actually to work with the Uzbek consulate to kind of put two 30-day visas back to back because you can't get an extended visa. So I was trying to work with them to, all right, how can I do this? So basically place them back to back so I could stay there for 30 days. And then also go to the Kazakh visa or the Kazakh embassy in New York and get an extended visa. So I had to fly home no matter what. So it worked out that I kind of was wintering in Georgia. I get these visas. I fly back to Georgia for spring, and then I'm going to start this like sprint basically through Azerbaijan, a little bit of Kazakhstan, across Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, up Kazakhstan into Mongolia, and before
Yeah.
winter sets in. So that's the plan. And so, I'd leave. I guess it was, I don't know if it was February. I'd have to look if I left in February or early March. It was one of those. And I'd start, I'm like, all right, we got to fly. We got to get to this boat across on the other side of Azerbaijan. I'm going to ferry over to Kazakhstan and get across there real quick. And I'm up in the mountains. I remember it was a very cold day, and this guy comes out of the fog, this worker, he's around a samovar, some coals, cooking tea or boiling tea. And he's saying Baki closed, when Baku was the capital. I'm like, all right, yeah, I don't know what he's talking about. And I know there's some virus in Milan and there's a couple cases there or whatever, but it's still, it's a slow burn at that point. And then I guess maybe 5 days so pass, whatever, and it's this really quick ramp up all of a sudden where all these countries are closing around me, and kind of next thing I know, Georgia's closed behind me. Russia's closed to the north. Turkey's closed to the south. And Kazakhstan's closed across the Caspian. And all of a sudden, I'm basically stuck in Azerbaijan with an expiring visa. And luckily, also there was consulate flights out, I guess, as so I walked to Baku, the capital. I was like, I just gonna stay here and figure out, what to do next. And at the time I thought, all right, these 2 weeks, we're gonna be in lockdown for 2 weeks, and then they'll open up again and I'll be able to get into Kazakhstan, and then
Yeah.
maybe it'll shut down again, but then I'll be able to get over to Uzbekistan. And obviously it didn't work out that way. And so I ended up being stuck in Azerbaijan for the entire summer. And I could have taken an embassy flight home, but I would have had to leave Savannah. So like that wasn't an option. And thankfully, one of my followers knew basically the right hand for Aliyev, who's the president of Azerbaijan, and was like, I got approval that my visa's fine. And so I was able to stay there, with the extended visa and not have any worry about that. And And then once I was able to get a flight out, Kazakhstan was still closed and all these countries that I planned to walk. So, but as soon as I could get out, I flew to Turkey because it was one of the few large countries that was still open. And I was just walked around there for a few months until Uzbekistan opened and Kyrgyzstan opened. And then I was like, all right, I flew home, got the jab in back home in Philadelphia once it was available, and then I was able to get into Uzbekistan. I walked there for a month, and then Kyrgyzstan for 2 months. And kind of by the time my Kyrgyz visa was expiring, Kazakhstan was still closed, Mongolia was still closed, and Australia was there was no way I was going to get in Australia for who knows how long. You kind of knew even then, and so I thought, like, I've been out here for over 6 years already, and because the north section of this walk is so time sensitive, I would have had to wait a whole other year um, to have the opportunity to, realistically walk Kazakhstan and Mongolia again. And then I know even Australia, because it's so hot in summer, I wouldn't be able to walk it in summer. So I was like, you know what?
Yeah.
I'd walked long enough. I've been out here so long. I walked plenty of miles, and it's just not in my favor. So then I flew home and then walked from Seattle to New Jersey, and that was about 7 months. So that was the COVID experience. It was lockdown in Azerbaijan, some back to Turkey, seeing more of Turkey that I hadn't seen before, walking around there, and then Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah, I've heard Turkey's beautiful. I got a friend who was studying abroad in Jordan, and he's trying to go Turkey, and he's trying to become a Middle Eastern historian. He keeps on telling me how beautiful it is. The next time he goes to the Middle East, he wants me to come out and visit him in Turkey. But it's I mean, I will say this: a lot of people thought when COVID first started it was only going to be for 2 weeks. I mean, I was a senior in undergrad during 2020, so my senior year ended with COVID, and
Rough.
so that was an interesting experience. And but at least Siena did repay us by giving us an actual graduation ceremony a year later. So they did do us good in that regard.
Oh, that's
But
nice.
I will say one part of that story that does stick out to me is that one of your followers somehow knew the right-hand man, whether it be the chief of staff or whatever, of Azerbaijan's president. I mean, in some cases, well, a lot of people argue all cases, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And you got very lucky in that regard, I will say, that somehow
Absolutely.
somebody who followed you knew him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think realistically, it probably would have been fine to overstay the visa in that situation. Probably nothing would have happened, but it put my mind at ease for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So I got a kind of a lightning round question for you. It's not an actual lightning round, but it's kind of just one of those fast-paced questions.
Sure.
You went to, was it 36 or 38 countries? Say
38.
38. If you were given the option to only travel to any of them one more time, and you could only travel to it one more time in your life, which one of the 38 countries would it be?
And I can't travel to any of the other ones.
Yes, you can only
Uh,
have the one.
Oh, that's interesting. There's a different way to frame it. And I get to ask which one would you return to, but this is interesting, huh? Which one? Oh man. All right. Let's see. Man, that's tough. Oh, I mean, it's tough because I have family in Ireland and
Yeah.
in Uruguay and in Croatia, and I would love to go back to those places. Then I'm thinking, okay, which ones are like still very rich in history that I didn't dig into, that I didn't see. And my initial thought is Colombia or Italy.
Okay.
And Colombia in part because it's just so it's a bigger country and it's so diverse, and I feel like I really only skimmed the surface, even though I spent 3 months there. I feel like there's a lot more I could have dug into. And then Italy, just because Italy is amazing and like the food's incredible, and I would love to just go back and sit in a piazza and sip a cappuccino and feel like everything is perfect in life.
Whereabouts in Italy were you on your
I
trip?
mean, I was all over. I walked from Palermo across Sicily, took the ferry to the southern tip of the mainland, and then walked up to Naples, and then kind of around Rome up into Tuscany, and then over to Venice, and then into Slovenia that way. So I saw a lot of I slowed down a lot. I spent the full 90-day visa in Italy.
So I'm
And what's
guessing
funny
you.
is like even though I'm like this gangly white guy passing through a lot of these countries, and a lot of places I actually didn't feel super out of place because,
Yeah.
I'm in like dirty clothes and, pretty beat up, but there's like blue collar workers everywhere. And Italy was one of the few places where I'd be like passing through these villages and the women are just like impeccably dressed and the men are in these great tailored suits. I'm like, oh my God, you are such a dirtbag. Like just felt so grimy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the type of stuff that happens on travel sometimes. Sometimes you stick out like a sore thumb. I mean,
Yep.
two of the
You gotta be
countries
comfortable with it.
yeah, two of the countries I traveled to in my years were Kenya and Nepal. And Kenya, of course, I make the joke that I was a Kenyan in Kenya because everybody, like my professor when we were there, made sure to tell every Kenyan citizen what my last name was. And I make the joke that I went on a name pilgrimage to Kenya. But there, I mean, as a tall, lanky white guy too myself, I felt right out of place as well. But then you go to, but then you don't always just feel unsafe though. It's a weird dynamic when you're traveling, especially to a place when you don't look like everybody else.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I think there's a lot of remember in the beginning, and I talk about this example a lot because I think it's like I think it does the best job of describing what it's like to travel. But so in the beginning, when I was in Mexico, like the first day I'm in Reynosa or second day I'm in Reynosa, and I'm passing through these neighborhoods where, the houses are unfinished and they have this first story that's finished, and then the second story has the rebar sticking out of the top.
yeah,
And I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, like I'm in this bad neighborhood. Oh my gosh, there's all these unfinished houses. And then somewhere later down the line, I don't know where it was, maybe in South America or something, someone told me that, the reason the rebar is there is it's not because it's a bad neighborhood. It's like almost a sign of a good neighborhood. It's aspirational. They leave the rebar there because it's difficult to get loans. And so when they have the cash, then they can just stack on a new room, a second story, whatever it is. So the rebar is actually signs of aspiration. And I think what happens when you travel, I think in the beginning, it can feel like so much, there's so much newness coming at you, and you really don't have a gauge of what's safe and what's not safe. But then the more you travel, the more you see, the more that gauge gets fine-tuned, and you're better able to assess, like, am I actually in a bad neighborhood, or is it just uncomfortable because it's not what I'm used to? But you have to travel a lot to develop that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things that most people don't develop until they travel.
Oh,
Whereas like
absolutely.
people will sometimes think like I'm a person who's traveled to like I won this scholarship to go to another country, especially the places that other like especially Americans aren't used to going. Like I won the scholarship to go on this trip to with this organization, and I had a bunch of countries to pick from, and I chose Nepal. And a lot of people were kind of confused, like, wait, you had the ability to go to other places like Costa Rica or like Romania or like all these other very big touristy areas, and I chose Nepal. And some people, like when they think about these touristy areas, they're kind of like, oh, it's safe and this and that. But if you go someplace that's not touristy, it's dangerous. You're only going to see crazy people and all these other things. When the reality is kind of the opposite in some ways. I mean, you're going to find good people in all places, but then you also find bad in all places.
Yeah.
And it's it's just the nature of the world. But you'll find most of the time, as I've found, more good than bad.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, invariably yeah, it's 99.9% of people. It's good. And yeah, everywhere you go, you're going to encounter some oddballs, but that's just people.
Yeah. And I mean, we got a few minutes left, but one of the things I wanted to kind of say to you and kind of talk to you about was that, like, one of the things I like about this whole entire concept, um, and I think this is also partially why some people list like certain road trips on their bucket list, like doing the ring road in Iceland or driving cross country, is that you're not just hitting the touristy parts. You're going to the actual places that like people like you get to see the real part of that place in some ways. Like for I'm in New York and I'm outside the capital of Albany. I'm in Schenectady, but a lot of people when they say New York, they only think of like New York City, and everybody goes like, "Well, yeah, that's a big part of New York, but it's not the only part of New York." And for you, it's kind of like you got to see still those touristy areas, but you got to see also the parts that most people sometimes always think about as like flyover territory or I guess skip territory or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely thoughtful. It was intentional. And when I said, like, one of these things that I valued, that I wanted out of life, was to be forced into adventure. Part of that was I wanted to be like forced into actually really understanding the world, in the sense of, like you said, not skipping over the in between and seeing just what daily life is like in other places. And I would say I would say basically probably the top 100 memories I have of the walk took place in places that weren't tourist destinations. There were these little mom and pop restaurants, or this little removed mountain that was on its own, and that I was the only person there. And then some serendipitous moment happened where I met some great people, or had this great meal, or discovered this great campsite, whatever it was. And I think traveling in that way, it just makes you more connected to the place as well, because you're more trusting of the place. And when you're more trusting of the place, you see it through a more realistic lens. You're not seeing it through this lens of fear, and that, oh, you have to drive through this neighborhood and drive through this, or jump over this area. You take it for what it is, and you trust in the goodness of people, and you trust in your own, competence. And then you can take the country, and you can take the place for what it presents you. And almost without exception, it's just people, and the dress is a little different, and the food's a little different. The trees are different, the temperature's different, the language is different, but it's just people trying to make some money, hang out with their family, and they're cooking what they have available to them. And
Yeah.
that's pretty much without exception.
Yeah. And I have two final questions for you. Number one being one of the things that like I was supposed to study abroad in college. I was going to go originally to Bosnia to study the Civil War, but then that program was shut down. So then I was going to go to Belgium because I was just like, all right, I'm already in Europe, might as well stay in Europe. And I didn't want to be the stereotypical, even though I have a bunch of English heritage, the foreign exchange student studies in England. Um, but I ended up not being able to go because Belgium apparently has a very strict visa system and everything. I have a clean background. Everything kind of went wrong with the visa there. But one of the things that they kept on prepping us on was, hey, just so you know, you're going to be their representation of America. They're going to be asking you a whole bunch of questions about like everything in America. They told us like, oh, you might even get a bunch of questions about the Kardashians. And so with that, I kind of wanted to ask you, like, did you end up having that in any places? And kind of what was that like if it did? And the second question, kind of the last question I kind of want to end this off with is what was kind of your biggest takeaway from this? What did you learn from all this, from this whole experience that you share now with only nine or so others?
So the first question, I would say yes to a degree. I would say more, it wasn't so much like I would get all these questions about America. I think what happened more often was that I would end up comparing America to whatever country I was in. So say I'm talking to a Croatian or a Chilean or whatever, and they would, we'd be talking about, okay, well, this is how America does this. And they say, oh, well, we do it this way. And so you kind of go back and forth on the differences and the
Yeah.
similarities. And so I think that I had that conversation much more often than it was people just asking about, American stereotypes or American tropes. And then on the second question, it's a tough one because you learn a lot from it. But I'd say the primary lesson and maybe the most applicable lesson is that people are really small.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that, we think we have all of this willpower and drive and determination that is enough and that is strong enough to direct your own life. But really, it's just an illusion. And I think it's an important illusion. I think you have to have some willpower and drive, and you have to have determination. But after traveling to so many places, you see just how much geography impacts someone's lives, or how the economic system impacts someone's lives, or how the history of the place impacts people. It's just all these massive forces that are really the true guiding, aspects of people. And so it's in a certain way, it's very liberating to know that you're people are really separate from their failures and their successes. And then the other part is really frustrating because it means when you have like a few bad actors at the top of the government, or a self-serving government, or for say people born in the Sahel in Burkina Faso in Africa, it's like it doesn't matter. There are so many smart people, there's so many driven people, and there's so many kind people out there, and they're never going to walk around the world because they weren't born in America with an American passport, and they didn't get a sponsor, and they didn't, have a good paying solar installing job. And it doesn't matter how determined they are and how clever they are, the odds are that they're just going to be where they are. And that's just the truth of the world. And so uh, I think what it comes down to is that you have to have really good systems in place to try and uplift people and give them the opportunity to shine and to grow and to live healthy lives.
Yeah, I think that's a very impactful, powerful note to kind of end this off on. And so with that, we're kind of out of time. So I want to say, Tom, thank you for being with us. And everybody out there in Radio Land, thank you for joining us.